Good morning, everybody. We'll be reading Ephesians chapter 4, verses 7 to 16. This is about continuing on unity in the body of Christ. As Christians, we need to be. But to each one of us, grace has been given as Christ apportioned it. That is why it says, when he ascended on high, he led captives in his train and gave gifts to men. What does he ascended mean, except that he also descended to the lower earthly regions? He who descended is the very one who ascended higher than all the heavens in order to fill the whole universe. It was he who gave some to be apostles, some to be prophets, some to be evangelists, and some to be pastors and teachers, to prepare God's people for works of service so that the body of Christ may be built up until all reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God and become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. Then we will no longer be infants tossed back and forth by the waves and blown here and there by every wind of teaching and by the cunning and craftiness of men in their deceitful scheming. Instead, speaking the truth in love, we will in all things grow up into him who is the head, that is Christ. From him, the whole body, joined and held together by every supporting ligament, grows and builds itself up in love as each part does its work.
As I was thinking about what would be the first lesson of 2014 or 2015, I thought it would be appropriate for us. Sometimes we think in terms of kind of a theme for the year, what we want to challenge one another to do and to be. And as Christians, there is always a concept that we want to talk about, and that is the idea of growth. There are many passages in the New Testament that talk about growth. Peter says that like newborn babes long for the pure spiritual milk of the word, that by it we may grow up in your salvation. I don't know about you, but I think that would be a great idea for us to think about for this year, growing up in our salvation. Later, Peter talks about growing in grace and knowledge. Paul in 2 Corinthians 10 speaks as your faith continues to grow. And I think as Christians, that's something that is especially important to us, that we want not just the faith we had when we became Christians, although, to be quite honest, there's nothing like the faith and the excitement of a new Christian, is there? And you may think back to the time when you made that decision to become a Christian and to give your life to Christ and to be baptized into him. And you think about just how motivated you were by that faith. But ideally, I think if we understand what Paul is saying, we want to grow from there. Hebrews, passage that I refer to a lot, where the writer of Hebrews, speaking to his audience, says, by this time you should be teachers. In other words, that you should have grown to the point that you are putting the word out. You're teaching others. He said, but unfortunately, and he's just addressed them as becoming, what he says, dull of hearing. And in that idea and context, he says, you have need for someone to teach you again the first principles of the oracles of God. Now, as we talk about growth, what kind of growth are we talking about? Well, Jesus, talking to his disciples, says that a disciple, when he is fully trained or taught, will be just like his teacher. And that's a pretty effective idea. One of the things I find really interesting is that you occasionally hear a story in the news about somebody, a teacher who is being recognized, and they will acknowledge a person, a teacher in their life. So that's a previous generation, and sometimes even they will acknowledge a teacher they had. You know, that one of the things about being a teacher, one of the greatest compliments for a teacher is that somebody else, one of their students, becomes a teacher. And Jesus basically says to his disciples, okay, when you have grown, you will reach a point where you are going to be starting to teach other people. Other ways we see it, the idea of growth, and some of you may remember, this is one of the most beautiful passages to me, where Paul uses the idea of children who imitate their father. And we realize that that's not a cheap imitation, that's not a satirical mimicry, but that is that respect and love and admiration that a little child has for a parent, that they want to be like dad, they want to be like mom. And Paul uses that illustration or that idea to talk about us being imitators of God. In Colossians, he speaks of the new self that bears the image of its creator. That as we grow, the direction we're growing, is not a physical growth, but it is a growing that reflects more and more the family that it's part of. And so in Romans, he says we are predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. That is what God has planned for his people, that is what he wants us to be doing and where he wants us to be going. It's what I want to call, the preachers always like to invent words sometimes, Christ growth. And there's a picture that's used in the New Testament that identifies and kind of presents this growth that we need and want to have and what it might look like. In Ephesians 4:13, Paul speaks of growing to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. Now, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to us in some ways, does it? Unless we think of the idea that we're growing to be like Christ. Somebody once coined the idea that we become little Christs, and that kind of becomes a little uncomfortable for us, and part of it is because Christ means Messiah, but in other words, if you think of Christ as simply, as a reference to the identity and person of Jesus, and you think of the fact that we are becoming his representation in the world around us, and that's what people are seeing in us. In verse 15, we just read, that we are growing up into him who is the head. In other words, you think of a physical body, and that's what Paul is using here, and that is a reference, an idea we come to a lot, that in this physical body, Jesus is the head of the body, and we are growing up into him. We often think of growth as being downward. In a sense it is, because growth is coming from him, but growth is being controlled and directed by the head. And so what the body does is led by the head. But I think Galatians 4:19 may have kind of a really powerful way of putting it. Now think about it. Paul speaks of the fact of until Christ is formed in you. Now, when I read that, the first thing I think about is a woman who's expecting a child. And we know the processes of that pregnancy. We know the development of the baby, and we know that at different stages, one of the terms that we use, we say in the early time of that the baby's not viable. That is, it's not complete, it's not ready to live on its own. But as it grows, it becomes more and more what we think of as a person. And as that little person is there, and one of the things that I think is always interesting, and I remember with our 4 kids, that every one of them was different as they were developing in the womb. And it was not a surprise, we found out later, that Mike was madly in love with music. And when we'd be in church and Diana would be singing, and she'd have this funny look on her face. And I'd say, well, what? And she'd say, he's doing loop-de-loops inside because I'm singing. And so we have, most mothers have stories about what their babies did that kind of indicated something about their personality and their preferences, even when they were still in the womb. But we think about that time that baby is growing and forming and being shaped. And then there's a day coming when it's time for the body to push it out into the world. Now, I realize that not every case is going to work like this, but the general principle or system seems to be that time comes for the baby is fully formed and ready to be pushed out into the world. Well, that image kind of has a little bit of meaning for me, except that as you think about Jesus being formed in us, that it's not a physical forming, and it's not with the intent that Jesus is coming out into the world from us, but rather that we are going out into the world more and more like him. And so that idea that Christ is formed in you, and so in Colossians he refers to Christ in you, the hope of glory. Now, I can't think of a higher goal or dream for a Christian than attaining that, what Jesus said, when a disciple's fully taught, he'll be just like his master. That we become like him. And we think like him. And we live like him. And so we have a connection with Christ because of this. It's a spiritual connection, yes. But it's inseparable. You think about it. Does your relationship with Christ turn on and off like a flashing light? See, our relationship with Christ is continual. It's constant. That Christ in us is ever present. And so we're inseparable. And so it is eternal. Once we become a Christian, Jesus is with us, and we will be with him forever. And so that helps to create in us and for us a nature, a character. You look through the New Testament. As I was working on, thinking about this lesson, I thought, I could just do a whole sermon right here about how that nature, how that character plays out in our lives. In other words, that what people see when they look at us, even as simple as Jesus saying, let your light so shine before men, they may see your example and what? Glorify your Father who's in heaven. That they see Jesus in us. Often in the New Testament, it's expressed in terms of the idea, and in this passage in Ephesians 4, with the idea of growing to be mature. And what mature means in this context, it is to be like Christ. That's the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. It's when we think like him, we walk like him, we talk like him. And Paul says that this is built by love. So, Jesus is the model for this growth. All right, so think first about the priority that Jesus gave to his relationship with God. It came first, foremost, and was everything. It wasn't a part-time thing. It wasn't an occasional thing. That no matter what the circumstances, no matter what even the hostility and opposition that he faced, his relationship with God was there. Therefore, his life was marked by obedience to God. He listened to God and to his word. And so it was reflected in character. What kind of person, one of the things when we talk about it and we study the life of Jesus, one of the things we keep looking at is, what was Jesus like? What kind of man was he? What kind of person? How did he deal with people? How did he deal with people even that he might not have liked? Or definitely, how did he deal with people who didn't like him? His righteousness. So many times people like to, profess to be Christians on one hand and live right on the line of unrighteousness to see how close they can get to doing those things they know that are not helpful or healthy spiritually. Did Jesus ever live like it? In other words, it's realizing that my growth needs to make me like Jesus. Several years ago, there was this thing, young people and others were wearing these bands of WWJD, what would Jesus do? And in a way, what people did with that was to become, they would project their own opinions and views onto Jesus. We need to look at who Jesus was, what he was, how he lived. And not what would Jesus do, what did Jesus do? What did he say? What was he like? And we come up with a character that is righteous, that is loving and forgiving, that is kind, even in the face of people that were not receptive or responsive. We as human beings struggle with forgiveness. And yet our model is one who on the cross or before the cross, in that immediate context, said, Father, what? Forgive them? They don't know what they're doing. They never asked to be forgiven. And from every human standard, they didn't deserve to be forgiven. Yet Jesus had a heart that could see the need and the hurt and the pain. As I was thinking about what idea I might use to sum this up, there's a song we have in our songbooks, and we like to sing it. But there's a line in that says, help of the helpless, the songs abide with me. And it's that reminder that Jesus was one who was willing to give himself to serve, to totally really forget himself in helping other people. And you think of the direction of our growth, and maybe even the priority that we give to growth as Christians. That maybe what we need to be doing this year as we make growth as Christians a challenge is to think in terms of looking more at the life of Jesus, what he was like, and how I need to put his character, his values, his priorities into my life. We have a song that we're going to close with that I think expresses that. And as we sing this song, always we want to encourage everybody to think about what is your relationship with Jesus like? Maybe you need to talk with one of the elders as a Christian, and you need to ask them to pray with you. Or maybe as one who's not yet a Christian, you want to make that decision. We want to encourage you to do that, to talk with me or Chad, one of the other elders. But if we can help you, please let us know. Let's stand as we